Rick Sanchez exists in a universe where knowledge has expanded beyond usefulness. His intelligence is not simply high, it is unbounded by ordinary human limits. He understands the mechanics of reality, the mathematics beneath existence, and the uncomfortable truth that the universe is vastly larger, older, and more indifferent than any personal story taking place within it. This understanding does not arrive as enlightenment. It arrives as erosion. At first, intelligence promises clarity. It suggests that with enough information, confusion will dissolve and meaning will emerge. For Rick, this promise fails. The more he learns, the more structure collapses. Patterns repeat themselves endlessly across space and time. Civilizations rise, decay, and vanish with mechanical predictability. Moral systems contradict one another yet function identically within their own borders. Suffering persists regardless of technological advancement. Love appears profound in one moment and statistically irrelevant in the next. Meaning does not disappear all at once. It thins. Rick's nihilism does not form as a philosophical hobby or an academic conclusion. It develops as a survival response to scale. When one mind becomes aware of infinity, ordinary significance struggles to survive. In a finite world, actions echo. In an infinite one, they dissolve. Every decision is mirrored by infinite alternatives. Every failure is succeeded by a version where it never happened. Every death is offset by countless survivals elsewhere. The emotional weight of events depends on uniqueness, and infinity erodes uniqueness completely. This erosion does not make Rick calm. It exhausts him. To perceive infinity continuously is to live in a state of permanent emotional jet lag. Nothing fully lands. Nothing fully matters long enough to justify attachment. When outcomes are endlessly replaceable, investment begins to feel naive. Rick's nihilism is not born from cruelty, it is born from overexposure. Over time, this overexposure teaches Rick a dangerous lesson. Caring hurts more than indifference. Attachment requires belief in durability. Love requires the assumption that something cannot be easily substituted. Meaning requires the hope that actions resonate beyond their immediate moment. Rick's awareness undermines all three. Nihilism becomes a protective layer, a way to blunt the constant abrasion of loss before it can be felt. Rather than allowing grief to arrive and settle, Rick preemptively dismisses the value of what could be lost. If nothing matters, then nothing can be taken away. This is the quiet logic beneath his worldview. It is not triumphant. It is defensive. The universe Rick inhabits does not reward sincerity. It repeats itself endlessly with slight variations, like a song that never resolves. When something breaks, another version exists intact somewhere else. When someone dies, replacements are available. This does not cheapen life automatically, but it changes how pain is processed. Grief relies on finality. Without finality, grief loses its shape and becomes ambient. Rick's nihilism organizes this ambient grief into something manageable. It gives him a framework that explains why nothing ever feels finished, why satisfaction fades quickly, why accomplishment tastes hollow. If nothing matters, then emptiness is not a failure of the self, but a feature of reality. This belief simplifies existence. It strips away expectation. It narrows emotional bandwidth. For someone constantly assaulted by cosmic perspective, simplification is relief. Yet nihilism, even when adopted gently, carries a cost. It flattens emotional landscapes. Joy becomes suspicious. Hope feels inefficient. Connection registers as temporary inconvenience. Rick's intelligence allows him to articulate this flattening with precision. But articulation does not equal healing. In Rick's world, control becomes a substitute for meaning. When nothing matters, at least outcomes can be engineered. When purpose evaporates, competence remains. Rick builds, destroys, and manipulates not because he believes these actions are meaningful, but because they prove that he still can act upon reality. Control reassures him that his consciousness is not entirely passive in an indifferent universe. However, control without meaning eventually turns inward. Rick begins sabotaging situations that might challenge his nihilism. When something begins to matter, he destabilizes it. When attachment forms, he undercuts it with irony or distance. This is not random behavior. It is consistency. Nihilism must be protected from contradiction. If meaning were allowed to persist, it would threaten the emotional armor Rick has built. To admit that something matters would reopen the vulnerability he sealed away long ago. It would require acknowledging that pain is unavoidable rather than optional. Nihilism allows him to believe that pain can be dismissed instead of endured. Yet the cracks in this belief appear constantly. Rick's actions often contradict his stated indifference. He intervenes when he could leave. He returns when escape is available. He preserves certain relationships despite declaring them meaningless. These contradictions are not mistakes in writing. They are evidence of unresolved humanity. Rick's nihilism is intellectual, but his behavior remains emotional. He is not a being who has transcended meaning. He is a being arguing with it continuously. Each act of self-sabotage doubles as confirmation and protest. Each dismissal of importance carries an undercurrent of disappointment that importance did not disappear as promised. This tension defines Rick more than nihilism itself. True nihilism is quiet. It does not need to announce itself. Rick's version is loud, defensive, and repetitive. It insists because it is fragile. Over long stretches of time, nihilism functions less as belief and more as habit. It becomes the default interpretation, applied automatically to new experiences. This does not require constant reaffirmation. It becomes background noise. Rick does not wake each day deciding that nothing matters. He wakes assuming it. Assumptions are powerful. They shape perception before conscious thought intervenes. When Rick encounters beauty, he contextualizes it as chemical reaction or evolutionary coincidence. When he encounters suffering, he frames it as statistical inevitability. These interpretations are not incorrect, but they are incomplete. They explain without engaging. Engagement is what Rick avoids most. To engage fully would require presence. Presence would allow pain to register. Nihilism allows distance. Despite this distance, moments of quiet undermine his worldview. Silence has a way of bypassing intellectual defenses. In stillness, the universe does not argue for meaning, but neither does it erase it. It simply exists. In these moments, Rick's nihilism does not provide comfort. It merely fills the space where comfort could have been. The show never frames Rick's philosophy as enlightenment. It frames it as adaptation. His nihilism is what happens when a mind expands faster than its capacity to emotionally integrate what it discovers. Intelligence outruns wisdom. Awareness outpaces acceptance. From this perspective, Rick is not wrong about the universe. He is incomplete in how he responds to it. Nihilism explains the absence of inherent meaning, but it does not dictate the absence of constructed meaning. Rick understands the first truth deeply. He resists the second. Constructed meaning requires humility. It requires accepting that meaning does not need cosmic endorsement to function. Rick struggles with this because his intelligence demands universal validation. If something matters, he wants it to matter everywhere, always. When it does not, he discards it entirely. This all-or-nothing thinking mirrors emotional trauma more than philosophy. When meaning fails once, Rick concludes, it always fails. Nihilism becomes certainty in a world that refuses to offer guarantees. As time passes, Rick's nihilism begins to resemble fatigue. The sharp edges dull. The declarations repeat. What once felt radical becomes routine. This is not the progression of a belief system. It is the wearing down of resistance. In the background, life continues, asserting small, stubborn significance. Not universal, not permanent, but real in the moment. Rick notices this, even when he denies it. His irritation often arises not from meaninglessness, but from meaning's persistence, despite his objections. The gentlest interpretation of Rick's nihilism is not that he believes nothing matters, but that he fears what would happen if something did. Meaning invites loss. Attachment invites grief. Care invites vulnerability. Nihilism promises escape from all three. It is a promise that never fully delivers. Rick's relationship with nihilism also reshapes how he perceives time. When nothing matters, the future loses urgency, and the past loses gravity. Events flatten into an ongoing present, punctuated by action but rarely processed. This temporal flattening is subtle, but it explains why Rick can move from catastrophe to triviality without visible transition. Without belief in lasting consequence, time becomes another disposable resource. This does not mean Rick is careless. On the contrary, he is often meticulous, but his care is technical rather than emotional. He plans with precision, anticipates variables and calculates outcomes, yet rarely pauses to consider what those outcomes mean internally. The inner life becomes optional when the external world can be engineered to behave predictably. Nihilism simplifies moral decision-making in this environment. If nothing matters, then no choice carries ultimate weight. Rick can justify extreme actions without confronting moral residue. Guilt requires belief in violated values. Nihilism dissolves values before they can be violated. However, guilt does not disappear entirely. It mutates. Instead of remorse, it manifests as irritability, detachment, or reckless behavior. Rick's self-destructive tendencies can be read as displaced guilt, emotion stripped of narrative and released without explanation. Nihilism does not eliminate feeling, it disorganizes it. This disorganization becomes especially apparent when Rick encounters versions of himself. The multiverse does not merely multiply reality, it multiplies identity. Each alternate Rick represents a different resolution to the same existential problem. Some embrace order, some embrace power, some embrace resignation. Rick's disdain for these alternatives often masks recognition. They are mirrors reflecting paths he might have taken. Seeing himself repeated endlessly reinforces his nihilism. Individuality feels compromised when identity becomes a variable. If he is interchangeable, then self-worth becomes difficult to justify. Nihilism offers a way out. If worth does not exist, then interchangeability is not an insult. Yet this logic fails emotionally. Humans, regardless of intelligence, experience themselves as singular. Rick's consciousness does not feel interchangeable, even when his intellect insists it is. The resulting tension creates constant friction between what he knows and what he feels. Rather than resolving this friction, Rick leans into it. He uses cynicism as a lubricant, allowing contradictions to slide past one another without confrontation. Humor, sarcasm, and exaggeration become tools for maintaining distance. They keep seriousness at bay. Seriousness, in Rick's world, is dangerous. To be serious is to acknowledge stakes. To acknowledge stakes is to admit vulnerability. Nihilism rejects stakes entirely. Despite this rejection, certain moments pierce through. Quiet aftermaths, lingering silences, spaces between action where no explanation is offered. In these moments, Rick's nihilism does not protect him. It simply fails to engage. The universe does not argue back. It waits. Waiting exposes the limits of intellectual defenses. Philosophy can explain why meaning is not inherent, but it cannot prevent the nervous system from responding to loss. Rick's body reacts even when his mind refuses to interpret. This is where the gentleness of his nihilism becomes apparent. It is not an aggressive assertion that nothing matters. It is a weary conclusion that caring has become unsustainable. The tone is not triumphant, but fatigued. Rick is not celebrating meaninglessness. He is managing it. Management, however, is not resolution. Over time, the energy required to maintain nihilism increases. Each dismissal of importance requires reinforcement. Each contradiction must be explained away. This constant cognitive labor contributes to Rick's exhaustion. In quieter interpretations, Rick's nihilism resembles depression more than philosophy. The flattening of affect, the preemptive dismissal of joy, the avoidance of attachment, and the reliance on intellect to override feeling are all consistent with emotional burnout. Nihilism provides language for this state, but it does not cause it. The show never presents a clear moment where Rick chooses nihilism. Instead, it accumulates. Losses stack. Disappointments repeat. Intelligence isolates. Over time, meaning erodes naturally, like stone worn down by water. Seen this way, Rick's worldview is understandable rather than admirable. It explains his behavior without endorsing it. It frames nihilism as consequence rather than achievement. What makes Rick compelling is not that he believes nothing matters, but that he continues acting as though something might, despite himself. He keeps moving. He keeps engaging with the world, even if only through conflict or control. Complete withdrawal would be easier. He does not choose it. This suggests that beneath nihilism there is still investment, still friction, still resistance. Nihilism has not eliminated meaning. It has suppressed it. Suppressed meaning does not disappear. It leaks. It emerges in unexpected places, moments of protection, hesitation, return. These leaks are quiet, often denied, but persistent. In this sense, Rick's nihilism is not the absence of meaning, but the refusal to acknowledge it openly. Acknowledgement would require vulnerability. Vulnerability would reopen wounds. The gentleness in explaining Rick's nihilism comes from recognizing this fear. His worldview is less about the universe and more about emotional self-preservation. It is a coping mechanism scaled to cosmic proportions. Understanding this does not negate the truth of his observations. The universe may indeed be indifferent. Meaning may indeed be constructed rather than discovered. But construction does not require illusion. It requires participation. Rick resists participation because participation entails risk. Nihilism allows him to observe without committing. Yet, observation alone is unsatisfying. Over time, even Rick's vast intellect cannot escape this. Meaninglessness explains the world, but it does not nourish the observer. The ongoing tension between explanation and nourishment defines Rick's arc more than any invention or adventure. It is the quiet engine beneath the chaos. The narrative will continue expanding this tension, moving slowly through the implications of living without belief in inherent meaning, and what remains when that belief is gently, persistently challenged. As this tension unfolds, Rick's nihilism begins to reveal its limits not through argument, but through repetition. When a belief must be restated constantly, it suggests that the believer is still negotiating with doubt. Certainty does not need reinforcement. Rick's worldview, however, is reinforced endlessly, as if to hold something in place that naturally wants to drift. This drift is subtle. It appears as hesitation before departure, as lingering attention to details that should be irrelevant, as irritation when meaning intrudes unexpectedly. These moments do not overthrow nihilism. They soften it. Softening is dangerous for a philosophy built on absolutes. Rick's nihilism relies on totality. Either nothing matters or the system fails. There is no room for partial significance, no allowance for temporary meaning. This rigidity mirrors emotional absolutism rather than logical necessity. Temporary meaning is not a contradiction. It does not claim permanence. It claims presence. Rick understands this intellectually, yet resists it emotionally. Presence demands awareness without escape. It asks for attention without guarantee. Rick prefers systems that guarantee outcomes. Invention, calculation, control. Meaning resists these structures. It exists regardless of optimization. When Rick encounters situations he cannot optimize emotionally, he disengages. Disengagement becomes routine. Over time, this routine reshapes personality. What began as protection becomes identity. Identity built on avoidance tends to hollow out from the inside. The external structure remains impressive, but the interior grows sparse. Rick's brilliance continues to impress, but it increasingly lacks warmth. Warmth is not a value nihilism encourages. Warmth implies connection. Connection implies vulnerability. Vulnerability implies potential loss. Loss is what Rick has organized his entire worldview around preventing. Not loss of life or resources, but loss of emotional equilibrium. Nihilism promised stability through indifference, yet indifference is unstable. It requires constant effort. Caring happens automatically. Not caring must be maintained. This maintenance explains Rick's exhaustion better than any physical burden. He is not tired from inventing or traveling. He is tired from holding himself at a distance from meaning. Distance dulls pain, but it also dulls relief. Joy becomes inaccessible, not because it is impossible, but because it has been defined out of relevance. Rick's nihilism sacrifices joy preemptively to avoid grief. This trade is rarely acknowledged explicitly. It operates quietly, shaping choices without announcing itself. Over time, the absence of joy begins to feel normal. This normalization is one of nihilism's most insidious effects. When nothing matters, nothing is missed, except it is. Missed opportunities do not announce themselves as loss. They register as restlessness, as irritation, as impulsive behavior that seeks stimulation without satisfaction. Rick's reckless actions can be read as attempts to feel something without naming it. Naming feelings would threaten the framework. Feelings imply value. Value contradicts nihilism. Thus, Rick's emotional life becomes abstract. He discusses experience in terms of mechanics and probability. He reframes attachment as chemistry. He reduces grief to biological response. These reframings are accurate but incomplete. Accuracy is not the same as adequacy. A description can be true without being sufficient. Rick's nihilism excels at description. It struggles with adequacy. Adequacy would require acknowledging that even in an indifferent universe, experience still occurs. Consciousness still registers. Pain still hurts. Pleasure still soothes. Meaning may not be universal, but experience is immediate. This immediacy undermines nihilism quietly. It does not argue. It persists. Rick's attempts to override immediacy through intellect succeed only partially. The body remains unconvinced. Emotional responses continue, despite philosophical objection. This creates a split between cognition and experience. Rick knows one thing and feels another. Nihilism governs the knowing. The feeling remains ungoverned. Rather than reconciling this split, Rick lives within it. The friction becomes familiar. Familiar discomfort is often preferred over uncertain healing. Healing would require confronting loss without intellectual anesthesia. It would require accepting that caring leads inevitably to pain, and choosing to care anyway. Rick's nihilism exists largely to avoid making that choice. Avoidance, however, does not resolve the underlying condition. It postpones it. As time accumulates, postponed emotion compounds. Rick's sharpness becomes edged with bitterness. His detachment hardens. The gentle nihilism of early resignation risks calcifying into something colder, yet the gentleness never fully disappears. It remains detectable in the quiet moments, in the pauses that are not filled with commentary, in the spaces where action stops and observation begins. These pauses are where the narrative breathes, where the universe is not framed as hostile or empty, but simply vast. Vastness does not negate meaning. It contextualizes it. Rick's mistake is not recognizing the universe's indifference. It is assuming that indifference nullifies experience. The universe does not care, but consciousness does. This distinction is subtle, but crucial. Meaning does not require cosmic endorsement. It requires engagement. Rick's nihilism blocks engagement, not because it disproves meaning, but because it refuses to participate in its construction. Participation feels risky. It opens the door to disappointment. Nihilism keeps the door closed, but closed doors also block light. As the narrative continues, this balance between protection and deprivation remains unresolved. Rick's nihilism neither fully collapses nor fully satisfies. It persists as a compromise that costs more than it saves. Understanding this does not condemn Rick. It contextualizes him. His worldview is not villainy or wisdom. It is adaptation under extreme conditions. Adaptations are rarely perfect. They trade one harm for another. Rick's nihilism trades vulnerability for isolation, pain for numbness, uncertainty for rigidity. What remains beneath it all is not emptiness, but unacknowledged longing. The longing is quiet. It does not demand resolution. It simply exists, waiting for space. And space, in a universe defined by infinity, is never the problem. The problem is willingness to occupy it. As Rick continues to occupy this space between explanation and experience, his nihilism begins to function less like a conclusion and more like a climate. It shapes everything without being consciously invoked. Like weather, it is always present, influencing mood, movement, and expectation. In this climate, hope becomes an anomaly, not impossible, but inconvenient. Hope implies anticipation. Anticipation implies disappointment. Rick avoids both by flattening expectation to zero. This strategy minimizes shock, but it also eliminates surprise. Surprise is not merely novelty. It is the moment when reality exceeds prediction. For someone as intelligent as Rick, surprise is rare. Nihilism ensures it stays that way. Yet the universe continues offering unpredictability. Chaos leaks through even the most comprehensive models. Rick can calculate probabilities, but probability is not certainty. When outcomes deviate, irritation surfaces, not because of failure, but because deviation threatens the illusion of total understanding. Total understanding is another substitute for meaning. If the universe can be fully mapped, then ambiguity disappears. Ambiguity is where emotional discomfort hides. Rick's nihilism pairs naturally with this desire for comprehension. Both reduce the unknown. Both promise mastery. Neither delivers peace. Peace requires acceptance rather than control. Acceptance acknowledges limits. Rick resists limits more than he resists meaning. His intelligence has trained him to override boundaries, not inhabit them. This resistance extends inward. Emotional limits are treated like design flaws. Instead of respecting them, Rick attempts to engineer around them. Substances, distractions, constant motion. Anything to prevent stillness. Stillness invites reflection. Reflection invites awareness. Awareness invites grief. Nihilism short-circuits this chain by declaring grief unnecessary. If nothing matters, grief is irrational. This logic appeals to intellect but fails to persuade emotion. Emotion does not require rational permission. Thus, grief persists beneath nihilism, unprocessed and diffuse. It does not present as sadness alone. It appears as cynicism, as volatility, as indifference masquerading as strength. Strength in this context becomes the ability to remain unaffected. Rick prides himself on this ability. Yet being unaffected is not the same as being resilient. Resilience bends. Indifference breaks quietly. Over time, the cost of indifference accumulates. Relationships thin. Moments blur. The world loses texture. Rick's universe becomes technically fascinating, but emotionally monochrome. This monochrome quality explains why stimulation escalates. When baseline experience is flattened, intensity becomes necessary to feel contrast. Risk increases. Boundaries are pushed. Consequences are dismissed. Dismissal of consequences is a hallmark of nihilism misunderstood. True nihilism does not deny consequence. It denies inherent value. Rick's behavior often conflates the two. Consequences still occur. Bodies react. Minds register. The absence of cosmic judgment does not erase local impact. Rick knows this. His actions suggest awareness, even when his philosophy denies importance. The contradiction persists. Contradiction is not failure. It is evidence of unresolved humanity. If Rick were fully nihilistic, there would be no tension, no anger, no investment. There would be quiet detachment. Instead, there is friction everywhere. This friction suggests that nihilism is not Rick's true resting state. It is a posture he maintains because alternatives feel more dangerous. Alternatives would require choosing values without guarantees. They would require caring without certainty of return. They would require vulnerability in a universe that offers no protection. Rick's intelligence sees these requirements clearly. His fear recoils. Fear, not emptiness, sits at the center of his nihilism. Fear of loss. Fear of insignificance. Fear that caring is a mistake. Nihilism reframes fear as wisdom. It gives fear intellectual dignity. This dignity is persuasive. It feels mature, realistic, hardened. Yet maturity is not the same as avoidance. The gentle explanation of Rick's nihilism must account for this difference. He is not shallow. He is overwhelmed. Overwhelm narrows perspective. It encourages simplification. Nihilism simplifies the universe to something manageable. Manageable does not mean fulfilling. As the narrative drifts forward, the question is not whether Rick is correct about the universe. It is whether correctness alone is sufficient for living within it. Living requires more than accuracy. It requires tolerance for uncertainty. It requires acceptance of partial answers. It requires willingness to experience what cannot be justified. Rick's nihilism resists all three. Resistance can be sustained for a long time, especially by someone capable of constant distraction. But it is never free. The cost accumulates quietly, not as a dramatic collapse, but as erosion. Erosion shows up as impatience, as exhaustion, as repetition without satisfaction. Rick's repeated declarations of meaninglessness are not revelations. They are reminders to himself. Reminders suggest doubt. Doubt suggests possibility. Possibility is what nihilism is meant to eliminate. Yet it persists. This persistence is not hopeful or optimistic. It is neutral. Meaning continues to appear not because it is inevitable, but because experience continues. As long as consciousness operates, valuation occurs. Attention itself is a form of value assignment. Rick cannot stop paying attention. Even when he claims not to care, attention leaks through. Where attention goes, meaning follows. Nihilism attempts to sever this link. It succeeds only partially. The remaining connection becomes the source of Rick's discomfort. He feels meaning without endorsing it. This is an unstable state. The narrative remains here for now, hovering between explanation and experience, observing how a mind as vast as Rick's attempts to live without anchoring itself to anything permanent. There is no resolution yet, only continuation. The universe remains indifferent. Consciousness remains sensitive. Between them, Rick persists. As Rick persists within this unstable balance, the notion of choice begins to blur. In an infinite universe, choice loses its dramatic framing. Every decision branches endlessly. Each possibility unfolds somewhere. The uniqueness of choosing one path over another diminishes when all paths exist simultaneously. Rick internalizes this multiplicity not as freedom, but as dilution. Choice no longer feels decisive. Commitment loses urgency. When every outcome exists, selecting one feels arbitrary. This perception feeds nihilism quietly. If choice does not eliminate alternatives, then responsibility becomes abstract. Rick can justify disengagement by appealing to inevitability. Somewhere, everything works out. Somewhere, everything fails. This somewhere else logic anesthetizes the present. However, lived experience does not occur in the abstract. It occurs here. Rick inhabits one thread at a time, regardless of how many others exist. Nihilism encourages him to forget this. Forgetting becomes a strategy. If the present is framed as just one iteration among infinite copies, its weight diminishes. Pain becomes statistically insignificant. Joy becomes replaceable. Yet, significance is not statistical. It is experiential. Rick's difficulty lies in translating this truth from theory into acceptance. His intellect resists privileging the present because doing so feels intellectually dishonest. Why care about one branch when infinite others exist? This question has no satisfying intellectual answer. It has only a practical one, because this is the branch being lived. Practical answers often feel insufficient to minds trained on abstraction. Rick dismisses them as naive. Naivety in his worldview is unforgivable. It suggests ignorance. It suggests comfort with incomplete understanding. Rick does not forgive ignorance easily, especially in himself. This intolerance extends inward. When he experiences emotional responses that contradict nihilism, he treats them as errors rather than information. He corrects them rather than listening. Correction suppresses rather than resolves. Over time, suppression requires increasing effort. The emotional system does not deactivate simply because it is ignored. It accumulates pressure. Pressure seeks release. Rick's volatility can be understood as pressure release without narrative. Emotion erupts without context because context has been denied. Nihilism explains why context is unnecessary. Emotion insists otherwise. This disagreement never resolves. It cycles. Cycles are exhausting. In quieter moments, when stimulation subsides and the universe stops demanding reaction, Rick's nihilism feels less convincing. Without constant reinforcement, it weakens. Silence does not validate meaninglessness. It simply removes distraction. In silence, the absence of meaning is not experienced as liberation. It is experienced as emptiness. Emptiness is not neutral. it is uncomfortable. Rick responds to discomfort reflexively. He fills space with noise, activity, or analysis, anything to avoid sitting with the sensation. This avoidance keeps nihilism intact. If emptiness were examined rather than escaped, it might reveal desire. Desire contradicts indifference. Desire suggests value. Value suggests vulnerability. Rick's worldview is constructed to prevent this chain from completing, yet the chain completes itself anyway, quietly, beneath awareness. The show often frames Rick's nihilism as wit or superiority. But beneath this surface lies fatigue. The performance of indifference is tiring. True indifference would not require performance. Rick's constant assertion that nothing matters is not proof of belief. It is evidence of effort. Effort implies resistance. Resistance implies force acting in opposition. Something is pushing back. That something is lived experience. Experience does not disappear when denied. It waits. Rick's nihilism allows him to delay engagement, but not eliminate it. Delay can feel like control. It creates the illusion of choice. Engage later. Feel later. Process later. Later accumulates. Eventually, later becomes now. Rick's fear is not that meaning is false, but that if he acknowledges meaning, he will be unable to survive its loss. This fear is understandable. Loss at cosmic scale is unbearable without insulation. Nihilism provides insulation. Insulation also blocks warmth. Warmth is not abstract. It is felt. Rick knows this, even when he refuses to articulate it. His actions betray him. He protects selectively. He returns unexpectedly. He intervenes despite professed indifference. These acts are not logical within nihilism. They are emotional. Emotion persists. The persistence of emotion does not invalidate nihilism philosophically. It challenges it practically. Philosophy can be internally consistent and still unlivable. Rick's nihilism is coherent. It is also corrosive. Corrosion does not happen suddenly. It happens gradually, invisibly, weakening structures that appear intact from the outside. Rick appears intact. Inside, something thins. The narrative does not rush to resolve this thinning. It observes it patiently, allowing the implications to unfold slowly. Rick continues moving through an infinite universe armed with certainty and exhaustion in equal measure. Certainty protects him from collapse. Exhaustion prevents him from growth. Between these forces, he exists, not enlightened, not empty, just suspended. Suspension becomes Rick's default state. Not despair, not peace, but a prolonged hovering between engagement and withdrawal. In this suspended state, nihilism serves as a stabilizer. It prevents freefall, even if it also prevents ascent. As long as Rick remains suspended, he avoids confronting the question. His worldview cannot answer what to do with experience once, since meaning is declared absent. Experience does not stop presenting itself. Sensation, memory, anticipation, and reaction continue, regardless of philosophical stance. Nihilism does not shut these processes down. It reframes them as irrelevant. Relevance, however, is not determined intellectually. It is determined by attention. Whatever holds attention acquires weight. Rick's attention is drawn repeatedly to the same patterns: loss, repetition, futility, control. These patterns reinforce nihilism because they align with its narrative. What contradicts it is noticed less, dismissed faster. This selective attention is not deception. It is coherence maintenance. Every worldview filters reality to remain intact. Rick's filter is particularly strict because the worldview it protects is fragile. If meaning were allowed even temporary legitimacy, nihilism would have to share space. Sharing space implies compromise. Rick does not compromise easily. Compromise suggests limitation. Limitation suggests imperfection. Rick's identity is built on surpassing limits. To accept partial meaning would be to accept partial control. Control remains his most reliable anchor. Even when control fails, attempting it reassures him. Failure can be rationalized. Lack of effort cannot. Thus, Rick acts constantly. Action fills space. Action delays reflection. Reflection would require slowing down. Slowing down would allow emotion to catch up. Emotion carries memory. Memory carries grief. Grief demands acknowledgement. Nihilism refuses acknowledgement. This refusal does not eliminate grief. It disperses it. Dispersed grief does not heal. It lingers as atmosphere. Atmosphere shapes perception. Perception reinforces worldview. The cycle completes. Understanding Rick's nihilism gently means recognizing this cycle without condemning it. It is not chosen freely. It is assembled gradually from necessity. When the universe offers no guarantees and intelligence strips away comforting illusions, something must replace them. Nihilism is efficient. Efficiency, however, is not kindness. Rick's worldview is optimized for survival, not fulfillment. Survival without fulfillment becomes endurance. Endurance dulls sensitivity. Dulled sensitivity reinforces nihilism. The loop tightens. Occasionally, something disrupts this loop. Not dramatically, subtly. A pause. A moment where control is unnecessary, where nothing needs fixing. In these moments, nihilism has nothing to do. It cannot optimize stillness. It cannot calculate presence. It cannot dismiss sensation without first noticing it. These moments are brief. Rick rarely allows them to persist, but they reveal something important. Nihilism is not all-encompassing. It leaves gaps. Gaps are uncomfortable because they are unstructured. Unstructured space invites experience without explanation. Experience without explanation threatens Rick's sense of mastery. Mastery is how he keeps fear contained. Fear returns when mastery relaxes. Fear does not announce itself as terror. It arrives as unease. Unease motivates movement. Movement reasserts control. Control reinstates nihilism. The cycle resumes. From the outside, this appears as confidence. From the inside, it feels like maintenance. Maintenance never ends. Rick's nihilism must be continuously upheld against the natural tendency of consciousness to care. Caring is not a philosophical position. It is a biological one. Intellect can argue against it. It cannot erase it. Rick's intelligence is powerful enough to construct arguments that justify disengagement, but not powerful enough to override embodiment. Embodiment anchors experience locally. Local experience resists abstraction. This resistance irritates Rick. Irritation masks vulnerability. Vulnerability threatens nihilism. The gentler reading of Rick's worldview acknowledges this irritation not as arrogance, but as fatigue. Fatigue accumulates when a system is pushed beyond its natural tolerance. Rick's mind has been pushed far beyond the scale it evolved to inhabit. The human nervous system did not develop to comprehend infinity. Rick's intellect forces it to try. Nihilism functions as shock absorption. It reduces emotional amplitude. Reduced amplitude allows continued operation. Operation replaces reflection. Reflection risks collapse. Collapse is what Rick fears most. Not physical collapse, but emotional disintegration. Nihilism promises coherence. Coherence feels safer than healing. Healing requires surrender. Rick does not surrender. Thus, he persists. The universe continues indifferent. Experience continues immediate. Between them, Rick maintains balance through denial. The balance is imperfect, but it holds, for now. Over extended stretches of time, endurance begins to resemble stagnation. Rick's nihilism keeps him functional, but it does not allow transformation. Nothing fundamentally changes because change would require reevaluating the premise that nothing matters. Transformation requires belief that the future can be different in a meaningful way. Nihilism denies this distinction. Differences exist, but they are cosmetic. Underneath, everything resolves to the same emptiness. This belief removes incentive for growth. Improvement becomes technical rather than personal. Rick refines tools, not self. Self-refinement would require acknowledging deficiencies unrelated to intelligence. It would require accepting emotional limitation. Rick avoids this. Avoidance shapes habit. Habit shapes character. Character becomes destiny. Rick's destiny, if defined solely by nihilism, is repetition. Not dramatic failure, but circular motion. Circular motion creates the illusion of progress while remaining in place. This illusion satisfies intellect temporarily. It does not satisfy experience. Experience begins to feel thin. Thinness is difficult to articulate. It is not pain. It is absence. Absence motivates stimulation. Stimulation escalates. Escalation becomes unsustainable. Rick compensates with detachment. Detachment deepens nihilism. The pattern continues. Gentle explanation does not moralize this pattern. It observes it. Rick is not broken. He is adapted. Adaptation prioritizes survival over richness. In an indifferent universe, survival feels like the only rational goal. Meaning feels indulgent. Rick treats indulgence with suspicion. Suspicion hardens into dismissal. Dismissal becomes identity. Identity resists challenge. Challenge threatens stability. Stability is maintained. The cost is interior movement. Movement inward would disrupt equilibrium. Rick prefers motion outward. Outward motion is measurable. Inner motion is not. What cannot be measured feels untrustworthy. Rick trusts what he can calculate. Calculation reduces uncertainty. Reduced uncertainty feels safe. Safety becomes priority. Safety replaces curiosity. Curiosity without safety feels dangerous. Yet curiosity is what once drove Rick. That curiosity expanded outward until it collapsed inward. The collapse was not catastrophic. It was gradual. As understanding increased, wonder diminished. Wonder requires mystery. Rick solved too much. With mystery gone, awe disappeared. Awe supports meaning. Without awe, nihilism flourishes. Flourishing does not imply health. It implies dominance. Dominance suppresses alternatives. Suppression does not eliminate them. They persist quietly. Quiet persistence defines Rick's remaining humanity. It does not shout. It waits. Occasionally, it surfaces as hesitation, as reluctance, as return. These moments are brief and easily rationalized away. Rationalization preserves the worldview. Preservation becomes the main task. Rick becomes curator of his own indifference. Curation requires effort. Effort signals strain. Strain accumulates. The accumulation is invisible until it is not. The narrative does not rush toward that visibility. It allows time to pass. Time in an infinite universe is abundant. Abundance cheapens urgency. Without urgency, decisions drift. Drift feel.